The prisoners! There was not a sound in the forest save the indistinct, fluttering sound of the snow falling on the trees. It had been snowing since noon, a little fine snow that covered the branches as with frozen moss, and spread a silvery covering over the dead leaves in the ditches, and covered the roads with a white, yielding carpet, and made still more intense the boundless silence of this ocean of trees. Before the door of the forester's dwelling a young woman, her arms bare to the elbow, was chopping wood with a hatchet on a block of stone. She was tall, slender, strong, a true girl of the woods, daughter and wife of a forester. A voice called from within the house. "We are alone tonight, Berthin. You must come in. It is getting dark, and there may be Prussians or wolves about." "I've just finished, mother," replied the young woman, splitting as she spoke an immense log of wood with strong, deft blows, which expanded her chest each time she raised her arms to strike. "Here I am. There's no need to be afraid. It's quite light still." Then she gathered up her sticks and logs, piled them in the chimney corner, went back to close the great oaken shutters, and finally came in, drawing behind her the heavy bolts of the door. Her mother, a wrinkled old woman whom age had rendered timid, was spinning by the fireside. "I am uneasy," she said, "when your father's not here. 2 women are not much good." "Oh," said the younger woman, "I'd cheerfully kill a wolf or a Prussian if it came to that." And she glanced at a heavy revolver hanging above the hearth. Her husband had been called upon to serve in the army at the beginning of the Prussian invasion, and the 2 women had remained alone with the old father, a keeper named Nicholas Pitchan, sometimes called Longlegs, who refused obstinately to leave his home and take refuge in the town. This town was Rethel, an ancient stronghold built on a rock. Its inhabitants were patriotic and had made up their minds to resist the invaders, to fortify their native place, and, if need be, to stand a siege as in the good old days. Twice already, under Henry IV and under Louis XIV, the people of Rethel had distinguished themselves by their heroic defense of their town. They would do as much now, by Gad, or else be slaughtered within their own walls. They had therefore bought cannon and rifles, organized a militia, and formed themselves into battalions and companies, and now spent their time drilling all day long in the square. All bakers, grocers, butchers, lawyers, carpenters, booksellers, chemists took their turn at military training at regular hours of the day, under the auspices of Monsieur Lavigne, a former non-commissioned officer in the dragoons, now a draper, having married the daughter and inherited the business of Monsieur Ravaudin, senior. He had taken the rank of commanding officer in Rethel, and, seeing that all the young men had gone off to the war, he had enlisted all the others who were in favor of resisting an attack. Fat men now invariably walked the streets at a rapid pace to reduce their weight and improve their breathing, and weak men carried weights to strengthen their muscles. And they awaited the Prussians, but the Prussians did not appear. They were not far off, however, for twice already their scouts had penetrated as far as the forest dwelling of Nicholas Pitchan, called Longlegs. The old keeper, who could run like a fox, had come and warned the town. The guns had been got ready, but the enemy had not shown themselves. Longlegs' dwelling served as an outpost in the Aveline forest. Twice a week the old man went to the town for provisions and brought the citizens news of the outlying district. On this particular day he had gone to announce the fact that a small detachment of German infantry had halted at his house the day before, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and had left again almost immediately. The non-commissioned officer in charge spoke French. When the old man set out like this, he took with him his dogs, 2 powerful animals with the jaws of lions, as a safeguard against the wolves, which were beginning to get fierce, and he left directions with the 2 women to barricade themselves securely within their dwelling as soon as night fell. The younger feared nothing, but her mother was always apprehensive and repeated continually, "We'll come to grief one of these days, you see if we don't." This evening she was, if possible, more nervous than ever. "Do you know what time your father will be back?" she asked. "Oh, not before 11, for certain. When he dines with the commandant, he's always late." And Berthan was hanging her pot over the fire to warm the soup when she suddenly stood still, listening attentively to a sound that had reached her through the chimney. "There are people walking in the wood," she said. "7 or 8 men at least." The terrified old woman stopped her spinning wheel and gasped. "Oh, my God! And your father not here?" She had scarcely finished speaking when a succession of violent blows shook the door. As the woman made no reply, a loud, guttural voice shouted, "Open the door!" After a brief silence, the same voice repeated, "Open the door or I'll break it down." Berthan took the heavy revolver from its hook, slipped it into the pocket of her skirt, and, putting her ear to the door, asked, "Who are you?" demanded the young woman. "What do you want?" "The detachment that came here the other day," replied the voice. "My men and I have lost our way in the forest since morning. Open the door, or I'll break it down." The forester's daughter had no choice. She shot back the heavy bolts, threw open the ponderous shutter, and perceived in the wan light of the snow 6 men, 6 Prussian soldiers, the same who had visited the house the day before. "What are you doing here at this time of night?" she asked dauntlessly. "I lost my bearings," replied the officer, "lost them completely. Then I recognized this house. I've eaten nothing since morning, nor my men either. But I'm quite alone with my mother this evening," said Berthan. "Never mind," replied the soldier, who seemed a decent sort of fellow. "We won't do you any harm, but you must give us something to eat. We are nearly dead with hunger and fatigue." Then the girl moved aside. "Come in," she said. Then entered, covered with snow, their helmets sprinkled with a creamy-looking froth, which gave them the appearance of meringues. They seemed utterly worn out. The young woman pointed to the wooden benches on either side of the large table. "Sit down," she said, "and I'll make you some soup. You certainly look tired out, and no mistake." Then she bolted the door afresh. She put more water in the pot, added butter and potatoes, then, taking down a piece of bacon from a hook in the chimney earner, cut it in 2 and slipped half of it into the pot. The 6 men watched her movements with hungry eyes. They had placed their rifles and helmets in a corner and waited for supper, as well behaved as children on a school bench. The old mother had resumed her spinning, casting from time to time a furtive and uneasy glance at the soldiers. Nothing was to be heard save the humming of the wheel, the crackling of the fire, and the singing of the water in the pot. But suddenly a strange noise, a sound like the harsh breathing of some wild animal sniffing under the door, startled the occupants of the room. The German officer sprang toward the rifles. Berthan stopped him with a gesture and said, smilingly, "It's only the wolves. They are like you, prowling hungry through the forest." The incredulous man wanted to see with his own eyes, and as soon as the door was opened, he perceived 2 large grayish animals disappearing with long, swinging trot into the darkness. He returned to his seat, muttering, "I wouldn't have believed it," and he waited quietly till supper was ready. The men devoured their meal voraciously, with mouths stretched to their ears that they might swallow the more. Their round eyes opened at the same time as their jaws, and as the soup coursed down their throats, it made a noise like the gurgling of water in a rainpipe. The 2 women watched in silence the movements of the big red beards. The potatoes seemed to be engulfed in these moving fleeces. But, as they were thirsty, the forester's daughter went down to the cellar to draw them some cider. She was gone some time. The cellar was small, with an arched ceiling, and had served, so people said, both as prison and as hiding-place during the Revolution. It was approached by means of a narrow, winding staircase, closed by a trapdoor at the farther end of the kitchen. When Berthan returned, she was smiling mysteriously to herself. She gave the Germans her jug of cider. Then she and her mother supped apart at the other end of the kitchen. The soldiers had finished eating, and were all 6 falling asleep as they sat round the table. Every now and then a forehead fell with a thud on the board, and the man, awakened suddenly, sat upright again. Berthan said to the officer, "Go and lie down, all of you, round the fire. There's lots of room for 6. I'm going up to my room with my mother." And the 2 women went upstairs. They could be heard locking the door and walking about overhead for a time. Then they were silent. The Prussians lay down on the floor, with their feet to the fire and their heads resting on their rolled-up cloaks. Soon all 6 snored loudly and uninterruptedly in 6 different keys. They had been sleeping for some time when a shot rang out so loudly that it seemed directed against the very walls of the house. The soldiers rose hastily. Then 3 more shots were fired. The door opened hastily, and Bertha appeared, barefooted and only half-dressed, with her candle in her hand and a scared look on her face. "There are the French," she stammered, "at least 200 of them. If they find you here, they'll burn the house down. For God's sake, hurry down into the cellar and don't make a sound, whatever you do. If you make any noise, we are lost." We'll go," replied the terrified officer. "Which is the way?" The young woman hurriedly raised the small, square trapdoor, and the 6 men disappeared one after another down the narrow, winding staircase, feeling their way as they went. But as soon as the spike of the last helmet was out of sight, Bertha lowered the heavy oaken lid, thick as a wall, hard as steel, furnished with the hinges and bolts of a prison cell, shot the 2 heavy bolts, and began to laugh long and silently, possessed with a mad longing to dance above the heads of her prisoners. They made no sound, enclosed in the cellar as in a strong-box, obtaining air only from a small, iron-barred vent-hole. Bertha lighted her fire again, hung the pot over it, and prepared more soup, saying to herself, "Father will be tired tonight." Then she sat and waited. The heavy pendulum of the clock swung to and fro with a monotonous tick. Every now and then the young woman cast an impatient glance at the dial, a glance which seemed to say, "I wish he'd be quick." But soon there was a sound of voices beneath her feet. Low, confused words reached her through the masonry which roofed the cellar. The Prussians were beginning to suspect the trick she had played them, and presently the officer came up the narrow staircase and knocked at the trapdoor. "Open the door," he cried. "What do you want?" she said.